Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Peter Wanders. I'm the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. I feel like I just have some hoot and holler with my hat, but I'm still, woo! We're really excited to have all of you here. This lecture series really drives a lot of great conversation, content of what's going on at the ranch. In addition to the people in the room, want to acknowledge the group in the cafe. They are watching this live stream so they can eat lunch. Some of the students on campus don't even want to eat lunch, so they are in their studio workshops where we are also being live streamed. So for all the students here working, making art in the studios, thank you for joining us via short circuit link. Want to quickly acknowledge the people who make this series possible. Toby Devin Lewis, who many of you know personally, has been a huge part of the ranch over the years. Her investment as the chief curator for the Progressive Collection really reinvented kind of the art incorporations world that Herbert Bayer drew with the Pepke family and the building of Container Corporation of America. That idea that the corporations and industry needs to support and engage and learn from the arts has been a central part of what Toby has brought over all these years. I also want to thank Oolite Arts. Oolite Arts is an art center out of Texas. I'm sorry, they're not out of Texas. They are out of Miami. But Dennis Scholl, who may or may not be here, I haven't spotted his eyes yet. Yay, he's a Texan. Dennis really helped build a connection between the ranch and Oolite and really helped raise the bar on how we run our artist in residence programs. Their work really committed to and building the careers of young artists matches Toby's commitment to that same cause, and we're really excited to have their support here as well. Mason Morris Real Estate, Coldwell Banker in town, is a big corporate sponsor for us. We really appreciate what they do for us as well. And Cultured Magazine is a media sponsor. So now that I have done my job, I will get to why you all came. We are so excited to have you here. Scott, you want to come up and join me? Yeah. Scott will lead us through a conversation. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his show. Scott is the chief curator and deputy director at the Whitney, and we are just thrilled to have him join us here today. There will be Q&A at the end of the program, so if you have some questions, please keep them in mind. We'll have you raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you so that those in the cafe, online, streaming, and in the studios can all hear those questions. So please, when that time comes, take the mic, stand up, say your name, and we'll do the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for having me. I am actually a Texan, like many of you are, but I left my hat at home, so I should have known. I could borrow yours just for a photo op. I'm delighted to be here. No, thank you, really. I should have boots that would help give me a little more height behind this podium, but I'm really delighted to be here. Better late than never, as I said. I was meant to be here last year talking about this show, which was also meant to be last year in celebration of Jasper Johns' 90th birthday, but he's 91, so I think there's even more to celebrate this year. And I'm going to talk in kind of two parts. First, a little primer on Jasper Johns' work, early work, and kind of why he made a difference as an artist in the 1950s and 60s, and that may be familiar to many of you, but just in case it isn't, we'll do that. And then we'll dive into talking about the exhibition, Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror, that opens on September 29th, the same day at both the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art, which is probably a head-scratching thing. What do you mean the same show in two places at the same time? And I'll give you a sneak preview as to how we've organized the show and even what it's going to look like. But before that, I will put on a little video that our digital content team made. It's sort of embarrassing for me to have to hear myself talk and see myself talk, but it'll also give you a sense of my co-curator on this project, Carlos Basualdo, who's in Philadelphia. I think of Jasper Johns as an icon. He's one of the greatest artists of the 20th century who's making incredible work in the 21st.
It's impossible to think about contemporary art today without thinking about Johns.
A poet, an explorer, someone who's breaking boundaries, challenging himself, challenging us.
Jasper Johns has worked to interrogate the possibility of meaning for the last 7 decades.
This exhibition is an extremely ambitious project. We're basically doing a 65-year survey of the work of Jasper Johns in every medium: paintings, prints, drawings, sculpture. in 2 sites at the same time. It opens the same day, this October, in Philadelphia and New York.
And so immediately the idea of mirroring came to our mind because Jasper has used that as a structural device.
And this became a kind of metaphor for how we would organize the exhibition. If the Whitney is a place that is so emphatically oriented towards contemporary art, Philadelphia has this incredible sweep of history. If the Whitney is a place that's focused on the art of the United States, Philadelphia covers the world.
I think that by coming together, we are able to complement each other and present a fuller picture.
Ideally, you'd see it in both places. Maybe you'd start in Philadelphia, jump on the train, and show up late at the Whitney, and have the kind of complete picture of Johns' career.
What I'm hoping is that the viewer will navigate between recognition and surprise. That is the space where Jasper's work operates.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here. Just kidding. I hope I didn't steal all my lines. If there's anyone in the back who's looking for a seat, there are a few in the front. I will gladly cede my guest lecture chair. I can see some people lingering. Just feel free to come in. As you can tell, I'm pretty casual about these things. So I wanted to start with this slide because I think it gives you a kind of, in a glimpse of an eye, a sense of the sweep of history that this exhibition covers. As I mentioned, Jasper, and please don't think I'm overly familiar if I call him that, but that's just sort of the zone that I'm in right now, is just turned 91 on May 15th. And he made his most important, earliest work beginning in 1954-55 with the flag that you see behind him, which is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And I like this comparison because you get the sense of really a 65-year sweep of history that this exhibition will cover, which is a really remarkable thing. I've never worked on an artist who's had such a long career, who became known so early in his life for his work and has continued to push himself and to create new work that feels, in fact, quite different and unexpected from the work that he made in the 50s. I think that if you looked at that early work and you saw what he was doing today, it would be really hard even to connect the dots between them. And that sense of longevity, as well as this sense of constant evolution, I think is really rare. If you think of other artists who have worked into their 90s, I'm thinking just off the top of my head, because I know Alex Katz is having a show at the Guggenheim next year, you might be more likely to make connections between Alex's work at any different decade along that trajectory, which is not a criticism of it. But when you look at what Jasper has done over this period, it's quite shocking almost in the range of what he's been up to. It's also important and interesting to remember that this is an artist who, since his very early years, since the time he was 30 years old, was regularly being hailed as, if not the greatest, among the greatest living artists. And he's had to exist and make new work within the context of his own fame in a way that is quite particular. You could think of an artist like Picasso having maybe struggled with or had to think about that, but Picasso's early work did not emerge in the same kind of media landscape that Jasper's did. And so what does it mean to be this kind of living human being talked about as someone in a history books at the same time as you're just like going into the studio every day and trying to make new work? And that's something I've thought a lot about. The Newsweek cover that you see on the right is actually was published in the center on the occasion of Johns' first Whitney retrospective in 1977. So it's wonderful that we're welcoming him and his work back to the museum so many years later. I won't delve too much into his early life, but just to give you a little bit of a sense, he was born in Georgia in 1930, grew up in South Carolina, had a kind of troubled childhood, I would say. His parents split up. He was raised at different times by his grandparents, his mother, kind of going back and forth to different places. And then he got out of the South, sort of via going to school first, and then in the Army. He was drafted and he served part of his time actually in Japan and ended up in the early 50s in New York to try to finally, as he put it, stop thinking that he was going to become an artist and just be one. And here you see him around that time in the 50s, actually photographed on the left by his then boyfriend, Robert Rauschenberg, who he said was the first real artist he ever met and had such a profound impact on him, both in his personal and his creative life. And on the right, photographed a little later by Dennis Hopper. As I mentioned, he and Rauschenberg had this incredible connection, and you see the two of them together on the left. But there were so many other people that Jasper was in dialogue with in the 60s and in the late 50s, including Merce Cunningham and John Cage, the composer and the choreographer. And if you think of the dialogue between those four individuals in their lives and in their work, it's kind of shocking to me what they did and how they were able to kind of cross-pollinate their ideas, and maybe the way that we think of Picasso and Diaghilev and Stravinsky at an earlier point in the 20th century. He was friends with Susan Sontag. He was friends with many different people and really part of a creative mix. I'm going to show you a few pictures from the Whitney's own collection from around 54, 55 to try to give you a sense of what maybe a certain kind of art looked like at this time. So if you had shown up at the Whitney to see a biennial, what would you have seen maybe? Some figurative painting by the likes of de Kooning or Grace Hartigan in a more abstract expressionist style. These were the things that Jasper would have encountered. Also, more abstract pictures like the Rothko on the left with its sort of sublime color sensibility, kind of a reaching for an ethereal space through the way that he manipulated the surface and the color. And I'm kind of contrasting this here with the work of Rauschenberg because it had a more vulgar and kind of everyday quality to it. His use of enamel house paint, of found materials like the polka dot printed fabric that would have been almost tacky to think about in the context of a room, let's say, that included a Rothko, and that would have been very important to him. You see the work of Charles Alston on the top right, another artist who was working in a figurative tradition at that time, and I won't go through all these slides, but you can see that art history has a way of kind of boiling down the context of what happened. Oh, there was abstract expressionism and then there was pop, and actually that's not a very accurate picture if you look at these works from our collection, really from the mid-50s. And this is the context into which this flag fell, like the kind of, like the boy who fell to earth. You have to get your head around the kind of rupture that this work created, because with hindsight, we say, oh, this is a masterpiece. We've seen it on the cover of a book. We read about it in our art history classes. And it's very difficult to retrieve sometimes the sense of the radical charge, the kind of affront that this work was to the sensibility of art at the time. This was a scandal, this flag. People were really upset about it. Terrible reviews. Artists like de Kooning were pissed off that this was the end of art. And why would that be? Something that to us seems like now an obvious masterpiece. You have to think that a flag like this was not thought to be an appropriate subject for quote-unquote fine or high art. It was so mundane, like numbers, like alphabets, the things that Johns was looking at. Another thing that really troubled people about this use of this iconography was not just what it was, but how it was depicted, that it was put so plainly on the picture, that it was a kind of direct transposition of a flat thing from the world onto the canvas. So there didn't seem like there was enough art in it. Had Jasper Johns painted a flag on a flagpole in a green field, people might have thought, oh, that's kind of great. But he didn't do that. He just painted the flag like a flag. And this kind of combination between, or contradiction or confusion, the subject of the artwork and the artwork itself was very challenging and even upsetting to people. He made these strokes on this surface using not a new material, but one that was kind of unusual at the time, called encaustic, which is basically hot wax mixed with pigment. It was an old technique that it requires heating the wax on a hot plate and painting on the strokes while the wax is still warm. What that achieves is a very factual, almost sculptural surface, because the wax dries very quickly, it hardens, and you can see every brushstroke very distinctly. This is quite different from Rothko blending these ethereal skeins of paint, or de Kooning painting wet into wet, where the paint kind of mushes together. You have a different kind of surface, in this case also collaged with newspaper that he would find around his studio. And all of these ideas were very important and challenging. And he had a phrase for the kinds of things he liked to paint. He said they were things the mind already knows, meaning something that if I said to you, picture a target or the number 8, you could picture that. He didn't have to invent his iconography or his subject matter. And that was, I think, a kind of modesty in a way, and also a kind of suffering from a little bit of artist block, if you will, at the time of abstract expressionism, when everything was being hailed through the kind of unbelievable invention that was coming out of these artists' mind, what Pollock was doing or de Kooning. And Johns was saying, look, I want to make a more impersonal art that subject is in a way a given that will then open on to other aspects of the culture on the one hand and to my art making on the other. And so these numbers, these targets, these things the mind already knows became a kind of scaffolding onto which he could explore other ideas. In this case, one of those ideas is the relationship between painting and sculpture, these kind of painting objects, paintings that are not windows onto another world, but sort of announce their thingness in space. They're in this room with you. You might touch the knobs on them if somebody let you. They're a thing as much as they are an artwork. And that, again, was a very challenging idea for a lot of people. He brought language more and more into the paintings as he started to think about labeling things, writing on them, what maybe is the difference between writing and painting, or let's say reading and looking, or sculpture and painting. Each of these objects, in a way, poses a lot of those questions, and I don't think there's a really good answer, but you get a sense of the philosophical territory that Johns was mining that became so important. Also in his sculpture, which actually there were not that many of them, but he made these wonderful trompe-l'oeil objects that kind of are like almost a wink or a nod to the idea of the artist as someone who duplicates or replicates something from the world. And in this case, he replicated something that probably didn't seem to many people worth replicating, a Savarin coffee can with his brushes in it. Or in the case of the famous Ballantine ale can sculpture, I love this quote where basically Bill de Kooning said that you could give that son of a bitch Leo Castelli anything, 2 beer cans, and he would sell them. And what did Jasper do? He made 2 beer cans, and Leo Castelli sold them. But why was this such an important sculpture and kind of challenge to the art of the time? If you're thinking about this in 1960, this is long before Warhol's Brillo box. You have an artist who is basically aping industry, manufacturing, commercial production in the 1960s in America is a huge and growing thing as part of the post-war economy. And the whole notion of what that is to make the same thing over and over again that looks the same, is the same, that you can buy in all different places. And so here, Johns is saying, hey, well, as an artist, I could kind of mix up this notion of what I do with my hand versus something that is made to replicate an object like bronze casting, and I could put 2 things that are kind of the same but a little different side by side, and we could think about what those differences might be, including that one of the cans actually looks open at the top, and if you were able to pick them up, that can is hollow. It's lighter inside. It's like the empty beer can. So how he starts to bring into his work different ideas about maybe the haptic, your touch, and your ability to sense something and experience it through a physical connection versus your eye. Even sound would come into his work. All very important ideas. I mentioned this kind of scandal of his work, and in 1958, he had his first show at the Leo Castelli Gallery on the Upper East Side. And for those of you who get to New York, if you visit the Michael Werner Gallery there, it is the same space, so you get an idea of what it felt like. And he had this show that very quickly landed him on the cover of Art News and in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And the work really was like a message in the bottle to so many young artists at the time. Ed Ruscha talks about having received this magazine. I'm not sure if he was in Oklahoma at the time or LA already, and that it just kind of changed his conception of what art could be. And I'm just going to show a few works from the 60s that suggest kind of the influence and the inspiration, this Promethean like fire lighting that Johns did that led in so many directions, of course, to pop art. If you think about the interest in these kind of everyday subjects and even ideas of mechanical reproduction, the kind of sensuous surfaces that we see in Bryce Marden, who didn't use exactly encaustic, but another way of working with wax and oil paint, Eva Hesse's incredible tonalities in her grays, and then I just threw in one cheat, which is not from the 60s, the Jeff Koons lobster on the right, but you could think of Fischli and Weiss, Via Selman, so many artists who built entire careers out of actually was a rather small idea in Johns' work in the 60s from these sculptures. And I would add to that artists like Glenn Ligon, whose show I did at the Whitney a few years ago, very influenced by Johns' use of stenciling. Talked recently to Howardina Pindell, who was very excited by his work in the 60s, and on and on. John Quick-to-See Smith is going to be on our audio guide talking about his maps. And so that legacy is really important to me. That thus concludes your 15-minute primer on the work of Jasper Johns in the 1960s. And now I'm going to get on with the show. As you saw in the video, the exhibition has been this kind of massive and complicated undertaking between these 2 institutions, both of which have a very deep and personal relationship with Jasper, as do the 2 curators, Carlos and I. And you know, this was an interesting idea that came up about 5.5 years ago. Both of us had idea that we might want to do a show with Jasper, kind of looking towards his 90th birthday and recognizing that on the East Coast there hadn't been a major retrospective since the 1996 show that was at MoMA. And if you think about it, 25 years is a big chunk of a 65-year career. So there was quite a lot of new work that had been made and that we really wanted to delve into. And we realized kind of soon in the conversations that this was not a show that could travel from one place to the other because the cities were too close and the loans were too dear. We were not going to be able to get these works to go from one place to the other. It was such a challenge to get them for one place even. And we had this idea, what if we did the same show in 2 parts simultaneously? And had that ever been done? And what would that look like? And could we use that as a way to delve even more deeply into Johns' work than we could have done in one site or the other? So I'll just mention that at the Whitney, you can see we have more than 200 works in our collection. We're very sort of proud of that history, but more than proud, I think I've been moved by it because I'm so aware of the extent to which my work as a curator is dependent on so many other curators who came before me, the patrons who brought these works into our collection, and quite a few of these works will be in the show, as well as some in Philadelphia that we're lending there. And you can see pictures of Jasper at different points in his career around the museum. I don't know, I have a laser pointer here. You can see him with Flora Miller Biddle, the granddaughter of our founder, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and her daughter, Fiona. And you can see him here at the opening of the 77 retrospective that I mentioned. Obviously with Rauschenberg, you see Warhol with the 3 flags. Here's Leo Castelli and Jim Rosenquist and our chairman emeritus, Leonard Lauder, who's been probably the most important patron of Johns' work at the Whitney, Leo Castelli, and also Roy Lichtenstein. So this is coming on a really wonderful, deep history. The show I mentioned from 77 had a catalog that was written by Michael Crichton, who was then a rather young novelist, and that was an unusual choice and kind of speaks to, I think, Jasper's desire to sort of sometimes fog the radar. And when in 1980, the Whitney acquired the 3 flags for the then unheard of sum of $1 million, which was thought to be the first time ever that a living American artist's work had achieved such a price, it ended up on the front page of the New York Times. I don't think that number sounds very shocking today, but you can see how for an artist like Johns, not just his ideas, but his market, his fame have all been kind of a part of this story, for better or worse, I would say, in his mind. And in Philadelphia, you have a similar long and very deep history. He originally went to the Philadelphia Museum with Rauschenberg in the late 1950s to see the Arnsberg collection, where there's a wonderful group of Duchamp's works, there still are, because he was compared to the work of Duchamp, and he said, I don't really even know who Duchamp is. I don't know this neo-Dada idea, and so they made a pilgrimage, and he maintained a lifelong interest and closeness with the museum. On the left, you see him there in the center with some of his artist and writer friends when he came for the opening of the Étang Donné, which I'm sure many of you have seen when you peek through the hole in the door, that Duchamp's posthumously unveiled masterpiece. And at that time, he met the director of the museum, Anne Darnancourt, who was not yet the director, who you see up here in the top left, who he forged a very long friendship with. And Johns represented the U.S. in the Venice Biennale in the 1980s and won the Golden Lion. And my co-curator, Carlos Basualdo, did a beautiful show recently called Dancing Around the Bride that celebrated the history of Johns, Cunningham, Duchamp, Cage, and Rauschenberg at Philadelphia, which you see on the right. So what does this whole mind mirror thing mean, and how are we going to do the show at one time in 2 parts? This was the biggest conceptual challenge. In the beginning, we thought, well, you could put the early work over here and the late work over there, work on paper here, the paintings there, and every one of those kind of, I would say, easy ideas immediately fell short for us because we wanted instead to do something that felt more interesting and in some way inspired by the nature of Johns' work itself. We also took for granted that most people will most likely see the show in only one city or the other. We hope that all of you and everyone will see it in 2 places, but it had to make sense in either one city or the other for the person who might not see them both. And the more we looked at Jasper's work, we felt that there was an idea that was kind of staring us right in the face, which was that throughout his entire career, going back to the 1950s, he had explored this idea of mirroring and doubling in his work, whether that was a thing in black and white and a thing in color, 2 ale cans within the same work, which itself is actually an addition of 2. Compositions like Corpse and Mirror, which are symmetrical around that center seam. Compositions like those of the seasons, which if you look at them actually across the calendar, winter and summer have a kind of inverse relationship to one another in terms of figure and ground. That play with figure and ground is so important in so many of his works like you see here. And we got this idea that the 2 shows might, in a way, echo or mirror one another, and that would be the sort of structural armature or metaphor for the exhibition, if not the theme of the show itself. So how does that work? What we did was to come up with essentially 10 ideas that we wanted to explore. These are kind of turns of mind, a way of getting inside the artist's head, thinking about how you could talk about his work from one gallery to the next, maybe not according to the traditional series, but to kind of modes of making. I was thinking about what Peter kept talking about, this being a maker's place. And so we would take an idea, and you see at the top, first motifs, and how could that idea be articulated with 2 different set of examples, one in each city. So at the Whitney, as you'll see, we'll dig deep into flags and maps, and at Philadelphia into numbers. Or, for example, we wanted to think about how Jasper, in his own early career, created exhibitions that were at the Castelli Gallery that he hung himself and made bodies of work for them. And so in Philadelphia, you'll see the 1960 Castelli show, and at the Whitney, the 1968 show. There are other examples of that, like you can see here, Japan and South Carolina, where we're exploring places where Johns lived and worked and how they might have affected his art. But in one place, you'll get one of these places, and in the other place, the other place. I got to work on that line. You can see I'm doing this without notes, so my apologies. One venue, the other place. But it should give you a sense, really, of how in either city you will get these 10 ideas, but just articulated through a totally different set of works. So I'm going to talk only about the Whitney because it gets too confusing to go back and forth between the Whitney and Philadelphia. And I should say, however, that we really co-curated this exhibition, the 2 of us. So in both cities, we came up with these ideas. Some of us took the lead on certain galleries that did not appear even in our respective cities. And then at a certain point in the process, it was almost like a game that became a gift. We gave each other the galleries. Like Carlos had worked a lot on the South Carolina gallery, and then he was like, oh, that's going to be at the Whitney, and now it was up to me to edit and install it. So the actual display strategies and the way things will look in each site are based on the curator of that site, but it was a collective project. And we had to reach out to the lenders together because some of the lenders are lending to both cities. Some are lending to one or the other. Some wanted to lend to the city they're not lending to. And we had to explain to them why their work about Japan would not be suited to be showed at the Whitney because the gallery's about South Carolina. So this puzzle was I've worked with some complicated shows. Definitely the most ambitious and difficult to sort through of anything I've worked on. And here you just see a schematic view of the Whitney from above, the 5th floor, and we'll use the whole 5th floor of the space. And we've done a very beautiful custom build out, almost like a bespoke suit, so that every work knows exactly where it's going, which should make the installation super easy, because I'll just sit back and watch it all get hung. Not exactly. And we're going to begin looking at Jasper's prints. I'm not checking my text, just the timing to make sure I don't go over. We're okay. I'm not going to talk through every gallery in the show, but a few to give you a sense of what we'll do. And this picture again shows this spread of his interest in printmaking throughout his career. And I wanted a kind of surprising and different exhibition opening than we've had at the Whitney. You tend to get off the elevator. If you've seen the wonderful Julie Meritou show there now, you're greeted by this kind of hero picture. We did that with the Warhol show with Stella. And in this case, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a 60-foot long kind of timeline or zipper of Johns' prints from the earliest in 1960 to one we hope will be completed in 2021, or edition that would be your print here. And that you'll get this idea of the spread, almost like a coming attraction for the show, of all the motifs. And this is a very recursive way of working Johns has, of reusing and using motifs again and again, and that this would give you a kind of, in a glimpse of an eye, a kind of snapshot. And all of these prints are from the Whitney's collection, I think except for one. And if its owner is listening, you know who you are. And then if you look back towards the start of the show, you'll see this chronology in reverse from the earliest prints on this side, the most recent on this side to the earliest on that side. And printmaking is not a sidelight for Johns. It's not something that's like, oh, I made the print of the painting, now you can buy a cheaper edition version of it. It's a place where many ideas are generated. It's an anthological process where he brings ideas together, and it's also a generative process where he explores things in new ways, and especially those ideas of mirroring and reversal that I was mentioning. In the first gallery of the show, we won't start with those kind of pop pictures I think that people expect, but rather a very moody group of works, largely in gray, although the point of that room is not about being gray, but about a sense of kind of withholding, hiding, secrecy, maybe not bearing your soul like those abstract expressionist artists were, but kind of taking a different approach to the mood of the work, to what one divulges about oneself and what one doesn't. And in fact, speaking about oneself, there will be intimations of his biography. In 1961 is the year that Rauschenberg definitively moved out of the building that they shared together to be with the dancer Steve Paxton. And this was a very kind of brutal breakup event in Jasper's life. And he made some of the most doleful and wryly works of his career. And you see this wall, which is a kind of breakup wall, all works in 1961, Liar, Water Freezes, the kind of chilliness of that, Good Time Charlie, this upside down cup, which is a kind of reference maybe to Rauschenberg, who was thought to be such a good time guy. He was so charming and ebullient, unlike Johns, who was so reserved. So even in this gallery that is thinking about, withholding to some degree, there'll be, I think, a lot of very powerful emotion, Painting Bitten by a Man, and a way of talking about Johns' life and his biography in relation to his work. I would say the gallery that I dreamed the most of since the very beginning was this one, which was a kind of long and stately room, almost like an old-fashioned picture gallery that would pair the flags and maps that he had done in black and white on one side of the room and in color on the other side. And this was the hardest in terms of getting these loans. Many of these paintings have not traveled in a generation and probably won't again. So if you don't have New York on your calendar, you better come at Philadelphia. And you really get this idea of how this symbol of America, these two symbols, the flag and the map, could lead you to think about many different things in relation to this country. Is something like the three flags a celebratory, patriotic kind of image, or is it actually kind of hectoring in its jingoism? Is it like a little creepy how the flag's kind of coming out at you and sort of dizzying? Are these paintings celebrations, or are they sad, or is there some darkness over this country? You have to remember that many of these works were made at the height of the Cold War, even before the Civil Rights Movement, certainly when obviously the situation for Americans who were not white or not straight or maybe not men was quite different than it is today, and that's still an evolving project, obviously. And I wanted to just show this poster, which will include, to kind of show how when John sometimes made the palettes in reverse and did these things that felt a little jarring and putrid, there could be even a real political message attached to them. In this case, he was creating a work to benefit an anti-war in Vietnam fund to ask for a moratorium on the war in Vietnam. I'm embarrassed by that caption. I better change that, but yes, I did give that to the Whitney. The next gallery that I'll mention is this one about the South Carolina, and thinking about it as a place where he grew up, where he spent time in the 60s after his breakup on Edisto Island, South Carolina, and where later in his work he made work, or later in his career rather, living on the East Coast, he made work thinking back on his childhood. This painting, the studio, is from the Whitney's collection, and it has a really oceanic sense of scale. The sky, the sea come into this work. You actually are seeing on the left an imprint of the screen door of the studio. You see the palmetto frond that might be familiar to those of you who know the beach in the American South. You see the paint cans and brush on the right side, which would have been the implements of his studio, so it's becoming a kind of allegory for painting. We'll have in this gallery images made by Ugo Mulas, the Italian photographer there, prints like this one Pignon that has beach trash attached to the top. And I think it'll be kind of a moving, somewhat biographical, but somewhat physical and poetic sense of what he was up to at this time. Looking ahead, we'll have a gallery about the painting according to what. So each museum will have a gallery devoted to a single painting that will unpack in many ways. It's interesting, Johns throughout his career has made these kind of key paintings intermittently that gather together a lot of the ideas he'd been working on until that time, and also sort of spit out new ideas for prints, sometimes things he returned to 5, 6, 7 years later. So that is the case of according to what. And you can see in this gallery, I'm sorry that some of these pictures look so blown out, but a print series that he made with Gemini related to this painting. You can see the upside-down chair from the painting Watchmen in both. Some 5 years later, this whole body of prints, in fact, is just taking the sculptural details of that painting. So this whole gallery will be, we used to call it declining the painting, but we realized that nobody declined sentences anymore in grammar, and they didn't know what we meant, and they thought it meant like we were rejecting the painting, but almost in a grammatical sense, unpacking the painting. We'll do a deep dive into, at each venue, how Johns used printmaking, not just as an addition object approach to making things that were identical, but also things that were unique. So in Philadelphia, we'll look at working and trial proofs, which are the studies he made along the way to a final print. And at the Whitney, to monotypes, the Savarin monotypes that we're very lucky to have in our collection that relate to that poster. And this means that he was essentially working directly on a plate that then he was printing on the page. So there was no reproducible like etching plate, if you think about it like that. And the incredible variety, the color sensibility in these works is very strong in particular. I think Jasper Johns' color is something that's yet to be fully explored in a lot of ways. You can see this kind of analogy between the hatch motif and his handprint. It become a kind of signature of his. And then by the time you get to the final ones in the series, this very inventive use of counterproofing, where you run a print back through the press with another piece of paper on top, and then you open it up and you see this reversal. And so you're using a print as a kind of plate or matrix for the subsequent print. And if you go to Carbondale, you'll actually see some of these. I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to skip this gallery, but as I mentioned, we'll recreate a 1968 show at Leo Castelli. Exactly. The room will be the same size, and all the paintings are going to be exactly where they hung, which is cool. Here you can see how it will look at the Whitney. This is a sort of unknown body of work that I'm very excited about. And let's see. Then you'll come to a room that's kind of the hinge gallery or the brain of the show that is taking, in a very self-conscious way, this question of mirroring or doubling and unfurling it. I wouldn't even say unpacking it. And at the Whitney, I've designed a very stagey situation, a kind of mise-en-scène that will hopefully enliven those ideas in Johns' work in a kind of uncanny way. You might think ordinarily what you would do to put a pair of paintings that were made in relation to each other side by side on the wall, like these slideshows that you probably had in art history class. And I got really interested in this idea of actually seeing these things at 45-degree angles, almost like if you were opening your medicine cabinet, the way that the mirror changes, or looking in a side view mirror of your car, that angle of incident in mirroring that is so kind of interesting. And so you see here, we're going to build a slightly crazy, somewhat kaleidoscopic structure, which will even have a strip of mirror if I don't decide that that is way too insane and we delete it at the last minute, but I'm going for it. And at the center of that kaleidoscope will be the ale cans that you heard so much about, which is a kind of signature work in this doubling. And we'll have one edition of the ale cans at the Philadelphia Museum and one at the Whitney. And you can see these paintings, both titled Mirror's Edge, in fact, which have these upside-down compositions. If you look through the space, you'll see something like the racing thoughts in color and black and white hanging, again, perpendicular to one another, not side by side. So as you look around this room, you should have a very kind of strange sensation that's quite visceral, in fact, about what's going on in the work. And I should say that the whole show, to me, has been curated and will be installed with this sense of bringing a kind of sense of life and discovery and freshness to this body of work. I do not take for granted that people coming to the Whitney automatically assume that Jasper Johns is like, oh my God, the greatest living artist. For a lot of our younger people, it will seem like very old-fashioned or something that like rich people like. And I am coming at this as a 44-year-old curator, has a tremendous reverence for Johns' work, but also am the chief curator of an institution that's very enmeshed in the ideas of our present moment, and thinking, how can this show bring these works to life, make them feel fresh, restore to them that sense of discovery and risk that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. I'm going to I have to stop. I promised 15 minutes for questions. Well, actually, I'm on time. There'll be a small bonus gallery at the Whitney. We have 2 bonus galleries because we had more space that will treat Johns' small works from the 50s to the present. This is going to be installed kind of dark, like a Michelangelo drawing gallery or something with spotlights. And it's really interesting. Johns is one of the very few modern artists of the post-war era who has devoted throughout his entire career to making small works that he considers finished works, not studies or preparatory drawings. And that sense of the miniature, the attention to detail, the intimacy that he might like you to have with the work will probably feel very strongly contrasted, let's say, with a gallery that's a little more spectacular like I showed you. So each gallery should have a kind of different sense of how you would view the works, how you would relate to them physically. These are some of these little drawings, including this one, which is actually made on a plastic called Shrinky Dink, which you might have used with your kids or yourself. Talk about a small drawing where you actually make something and then you shrink it in the oven. Everything in this gallery will be no more than a few inches on a side, which I just think is going to be so fabulous and wild to see. We'll have the more recent work has a kind of reopening in it in terms of the subject matter, getting kind of wild. This idea of dreamy, surrealist iconography that really interested him throughout the 80s and 90s at the Whitney will be treated with a very pale kind of, I would say dreamlike palette. At Philadelphia, the Cognate Gallery will be very dark. It's going to be like nightmarish. And we'll curve the walls in this gallery. It's hard to see in this slide. You can see the first work he made actually when he moved to Sharon, Connecticut, how strange this is. These body parts taken from a Picasso painting that have kind of migrated to the edges of the painting and make the whole painting a kind of face looking on itself. If you recall what I said at the beginning, like this artist who's not been on autopilot, and I put this and a flag side by side and I showed them to a Martian, I don't know that Martian would be very easy to say, oh yeah, that's the same artist. Of course, sure. We have a way of kind of connecting these dots that, and almost I want to disconnect in this show to bring back this feeling of surprise and of the unknowable side of Jasper's work. There'll be this very beautiful floaty display of work on paper from this period, which uses watercolor, pastel materials that he's not so associated with, like you see here. Many works that are coming from Jasper's own collection that have never been exhibited publicly before. And then you'll have a moment to take advantage of the Whitney's river view. And for those of you who want to see Little Island from high, this is your chance to do it. It's right over there. And we'll look at his kind of recent return to numbers and also to sculpture, which are both a motif and a medium that he had barely touched for 30 years and kind of returned to for a complicated story that you'll have to come back. That's my talk tomorrow. Why did Jasper Johns return to numbers? But you'll see these beautiful sculptures in copper, in bronze, in aluminum, in silver, naturally lit to bring out the different qualities inherent in the materials. And finally, you will see a gallery that is about the most recent work, really through the lens of death, I would say, and mortality. And this has been very profound to work on for me, especially during the pandemic, to think about an artist who, when he reached his 70s, started to make work much more directly and bravely about being old and thinking about death. And I think there's not that many examples in the history of art of artists living as long and making late work as much about having lived so long and thinking about what comes next. So we'll have this wonderful catenary picture which is actually subtitled, I Call to the Grave, from the book of Job, with this thin string that has been compared to the fragile arc of life. We will have I'm having trouble going forward. If there's someone in the booth, can you advance? Yes, thank you. You'll see through to this, you can't really see them at all, but this regrets painting, you can go to the next slide, this kind of reinterpreting of a boy that he had used starting in the 80s, now as a kind of lonely figure, maybe the hollow of its chest inhabited by this woman from Picasso who's in despair or grief, this idea of mixing together images of old age and youth, of youth as a kind of passing shadow that's fading into darkness. Go to the next slide. And then a couple of series that he made of men in despair, frankly, a group of works that has come to be known as the Farley series, that were based on images of a Marine who lost his friend, his comrade, I should say, in Vietnam in battle. And you can see the work on the right, the photograph of Larry Burroughs that Johns has reinterpreted in some of the, I think, most grief-stricken and sad works of his career. But it's also been an incredible opportunity for him to rethink his materials and mediums, like this ink on plastic drawings, and sometimes using caustic on plastic. I'm trying to go faster. And then Johns himself suffered a very terrible personal loss and tragedy over a period of years. He was being really betrayed by his longtime studio assistant, and he's a very private person, and he worked closely with this guy, Jim Meyer, who stole unfinished works of his and resold them illegally. And the FBI got involved, and this was taken to court, and they were able to return quite a few of those works. And you have to imagine, for a man in his 80s, living alone, having relied on the assistant to be kind of like his memory, his brain, as well as his, almost like his hands sometimes, that loss had actually a very physically debilitating effect on Jasper. And when the works were returned, one of them, the one you see on the right, was an unfinished work related to the Four Seasons, which you might recognize. And he put on top of it this skeleton and this idea of, mortality, of grief, this grinning skeleton, kind of like there's almost a kind of grand guignol quality to these images that are sort of perverse and funny. There's another work that's coming into our collection, as you can see that relationship to the seasons. There's a detail here from a police blotter that he added, something with a dollar sign. So thinking about, greed and money and betrayal, crime, death, all in these works. And, some of you might have seen them when they were shown at Matthew Mark's gallery a couple of years ago, but I'm really excited to put them in the context of this late body of work, which sort of transcends any one series or motif to be this sort of elegy, in a way, so late in life. And we may have a few paintings that are, one painting that's just being finished, but certainly works on paper that haven't been seen before. And the last thing I'll mention, if I can have, is the catalog, which is the kind of third site of the show. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon. This is the place where both shows come together. So you can see in this catalog the two sets side by side, South Carolina and Japan, let's say, flags and maps and numbers. And you can see how we've organized it with some really beautiful plates, but also very surprising layouts of different works that will create their own visual essays as you move through the book. Sense of Jasper with the artists he knew in Japan. And we want this book to feel very kind of wild and charismatic, and hopefully something people will want to pick up, quite different from some of his recent monographs that feel maybe more like authoritative coffee table books. It's interesting because there was recently the catalogue raisonné of Johns's work, which are so definitive of his drawings and paintings. That was rather liberating, so that we didn't have to say, hey, this is the definitive end-all be-all book, but rather maybe this is a book where we kind of break things open. We open the barn door, we let some air blow in, we invite all sorts of writers, artists like Ralph Lemon, philosophers who've never thought about Jasper's work before to be a part of this conversation. And I think that if we do our job right, the show will maybe raise more questions than it answers, but really center this incredible body of work and bring a lot of new perspectives to it. So I think with that, I talked exactly 45 minutes, maybe even less, which was my allotted time. And I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions if any of you have them. And I really thank you for your patience. I see hands. I'm told that there are microphones going around, so I'll just call on people, and then they'll bring you the mic. Go ahead. And if you need to leave, that's fine too. I know it's a busy week.
Hey there. I think I've heard this talk a few times. So I'm stuck at where you began, and I'd like to ask you to freeform off topic for a second. You started with the flag, and you said it challenged sensibilities at the time of what's appropriate. And I immediately thought of so many things that have done that subsequently, whether it was a Robert Mapplethorpe show in D.C. or Andrea, the Piss Christ, Serrano's Piss Christ, or Chris O'Feely and religious pictures with camel dung, or maybe 3 Whitney biennials ago when Dana Schutz decided to do a portrait of Emmett Till in his coffin, and it created a big uprising from a political wokeness at the time, but then these artworks go on and become part of our canon. Can you just freeform riff on that concept a little bit? Because it's a fascinating, constant thing.
Well, I think that you've just defined modernism, John. So the whole idea of modern art, depending on where you put the origin of it in the 18th century, in the 19th century, some would say in the Renaissance, but let's stay in the 19th century, it makes it easier, was that artists would challenge themselves and their audience at any different time about what an artwork might depict and what an artwork could even be. So you would choose either a subject maybe that had not ever been in art before, or in some cases, like the Piss Christ, you're talking about things that would have been blasphemous in a different way than maybe a flag would be. That was blasphemous to the idea of what's an appropriate subject for painting, not is this against the Catholic Church. But in general, this notion of artists pushing themselves to find ways of making art that were outside of accepted traditional definitions of what an artwork is or could depict is the kind of story of modern art, basically. So I think that John's is a big part of that, obviously, and that's an ongoing thing. It continues today. You name some recent examples. Yes, please.
Hi, Scott. I have a question for you because, with the title being Mind, Matter, and having an artist being living at 91, a very weighty enterprise, when you spoke about the duality and speaking, it immediately for me recalled walking in 2015 into the Stella show and the painting called Jasper's Dilemma from 1962, that fantastic mitered concentric that addressed color and gray. And you spoke a bit, and especially as you go back to the last slide, you spoke a lot about
this side?
Color. Actually, the one before that, then. No, back, no. There, that's a perfect, oh, even this, either or. And it's so interesting in mind, because as you spoke about galleries, I think you, to kind of quote you, you said something like the Philadelphia gallery would be nightmarish, right? You said these are these ethereal pastels. And could you speak a few moments about that idea of Jasper's Dilemma, which, if anyone knows that painting, very colorful left, very gray right, and looking here, the play with color, and then the void of color, without hitting it over someone's head. The galleries, you said you walk into that dark, early paintings with the breakup of Rauschenberg, right? Concluding with a very grisaille palette at the end of his life and addressing color in between and working with Jasper. Did he have any kind of thoughts on that in terms of the psychology of what color has been within his artistic practice?
Great question. Well, to answer the last part before, working with Jasper has been a very interesting process because he, unlike any artist I've ever worked with, has had almost nothing to say about the making of the show. He has a really very deeply held kind of separation of church and state. It's like the artist makes the work and the curator makes the show. And he's been involved in the process the whole time. He is the single biggest lender to the exhibition, but he has given us total freedom to interpret his work as we like. And I think he's been kind of curious and amused by that at different times. It's like, oh, here's this guy who's half my age, has these ideas about his work, which maybe were not his ideas. And I think that's okay. There's a kind of subjectivity that a curator can bring to the process of creating a retrospective. People think like, oh, that's easy. If you go to like curatorial studies schools, they want to talk to you about doing group shows like the Whitney Biennial because the assumption is that there's a big idea there. But a retrospective is just like, you put the series in order. And so I don't think that, and I've almost only curated monographic shows, excluding those I've made from our collection. And so Jasper he will answer questions, but he's been totally non-directional. And that's been very different from, let's say, working with Jeff Koons or whatever, Glenn Ligon, Laura Owens, any number of artists I've worked with. In terms of Jasper's Dilemma, you're right, you're referring to this great Stella early painting, which has a gray side and a color side. And it's like Stella's another artist who took so much from Jasper's work early on, that idea of how you do something in color and black and white, and what is the difference. Some of you do this all the time on your camera with black and white film, where or on your iPhone, can interpret a colorful palette from something that is about how the colors are articulated through these gray scales. And that as something that Jasper did in very few works like the Stella, which actually bring the black and white and the color together. He tended to hold those apart, like you saw earlier the pairing of False Start and Jubilee, and also sometimes across mediums. So what this slide actually shows you is paintings here. This is a relief in silver. This is a drawing, a print. So often a graphic work would give him an excuse to do something in black and white because people think of like drawing as being primarily, in let's say grayscale. But it's something that he's done again and again and is one of those mind mirror ideas that the show will explore. You've had a question for a while.
Hello?
Oh, yes.
Here I am. Thank you so much for this lecture. I feel like I got an entire semester's worth of Jasper Johns. And I'm thinking kind of out loud, so I apologize if I'm not too articulate. But I feel like you've really illuminated for me how Johns really had one foot so firmly in Abex, but then the betrayal of Abex with the incredible depth of the emotional content in his work. So many of the pop imagery that would not be about the image, it would be about the use of paint and the method. But then how much even translating something from color into grayscale brings such a different emotional capacity to the work. Am I understanding correctly that that is what a big part of this revolution was, of Johns entering the scene?
Well, I think at the time, the revolution, it was thought to be that there was not as much emotion and invention in it as there should be in art. I think from my perspective, I see that really differently. And this show will, in some ways, I think through hopefully its very experiential and precise installation, grab you as much here as it will here. I think there's a kind of feeling around Johns' work that it's so esoteric, and you have to be able to unpack, especially in those works that have many different symbols, like what are all the symbols about? And I think that's great, and that would be next semester's course. But I feel like what I hope will come out of this show is the kind of, maybe that some of these formal choices or ideas actually come with a sort of concomitant emotional response either in the artist or in us. I think that it's not to be said lightly, like if you love de Kooning and you thought, as Jasper once said, well, de Kooning did what he did very well and he didn't need any help from me. But there is potentially a sadness to giving up a kind of training, a kind of idea about what art is in your own work. We're like, oh yeah, he's the young Turk who's toppling these people, but this is a tradition, a canon, his peers that he loved. And so I don't know if those ale cans are like the most celebratory fun thing, or is that an image of like, wow, go into 7-Eleven and which Snapple do you want, the blue one or the red one? They both work the same. Is this what modern life has become? Is this what the work of the artist has been reduced to? So that is me projecting. I'm not saying Jasper Johns made it to think about it along those terms, but I think there could be a lot of emotional energy in how I would view a sculpture like that, as opposed to one that was maybe more heroic in its, subject or its form. Okay, I think this should be the last question, or I promised I would end on time, but there's two more. Okay, so we'll do two questions. I can't choose between them. Mind mirror each other.
Okay, so I'm really provoked by his inaccessibility as an artist. He's in his 90s, but there's so many other artists who are of that generation, like Kusama and Wayne Thiebaud, who teach and who bring a sense of community around the art and bestowing their gifts to a greater public. And with Johns, you don't see exhibitions outside of a museum. I'm really fascinated. Who is this guy?
Mm-hmm. Who is Kusama? No, I mean, at this point in his life, he lives a not hermetic, but a rather solitary existence. He's just making his work. Some friends come to visit him. If you knew about him, and I just finished reading John Giorno's memoir, which is like kind of crazy, and Jasper was one of John Giorno's lovers, along with Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol. Talk about a hat trick in the 1960s. But that's a different lecture too. That's spring semester 2022. I digress. He was a very social person who was in the midst of a hugely roiling community of people, including those dancers and choreographers and writers I mentioned. He was friends with poets. He founded, and some of his generosity, I would say, has been very behind the scenes, a foundation that exists today called the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, that was maybe the first direct grant-making organization to living contemporary artists. Now there's a lot of organizations that do that, that he supported a lot with his own financial gifts, his time in hanging these exhibitions that he made. So I think there is a generosity of spirit in him and a kind of gregariousness that there was that just has changed as he's gotten older. I think he's been less interested, unlike Alex Katz, who I mentioned before, Ellsworth. Ellsworth couldn't wait to go to an opening of one of his shows and take the micro. He could take the microphone at a Matisse opening and be like, "What this makes me think of," which we loved Ellsworth doing that, but that is not what Jasper will be doing. He does not want that kind of public interaction or claim in that way. Go ahead. Last question.
Scott, thank you so much. It was a brilliant presentation. I've already ordered the catalog.
Oh, thank you.
I have 2 quick questions.
Did you order 2? No, I'm teasing.
I can do that. I have 2 homes. So 2 quick questions. One, if you had your way, which would you go to Philly or would you go to New York first? And 2, what is his favorite piece of art? Has he told you that? Thank you.
Okay. The answer to the second question is no. The answer to the first question is just you really could do either one. I think that, as I said, there's this kind of symmetry in the structures, and they both begin at the beginning and end at the end. I think if you were looking to save $1, because you get 50% off with your ticket stub, you should start in Philadelphia because it's a cheaper ticket. You'd save more money at the Whitney. But I'm guessing for this crowd, that's not the biggest concern. Or you could buy a cheaper membership in Philadelphia and then come to the Whitney and get in free. No, but I think really it's not, there isn't an order to the exhibition in that way. And, as I said, a lot of people won't see it both. We like the idea that some people might try and do it on the same day, start in New York and have lunch and get the train or get a car to take you to Philadelphia and see it. Or you might see them months or weeks apart on different trips if you live in the East Coast or are visiting, and that would be okay too. That echo effect, that sense of perception being altered by time and space is such a crucial aspect to Jasper's work. He himself has returned to motifs 10, 20, 30, 40 years apart, so there's no reason you couldn't return to motifs 2 months or 2 weeks or 2 hours apart. And in a way, the structure of the exhibition feels so Johnsian to us. I wouldn't have done this with de Kooning, let's say. And so I think that puzzle quality and that gap in experience could happen in either direction. Okay, thank you.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All of you, thank you for coming here. We did find the fastest talking Texan we could, so thanks for keeping us on time. Really excited to have you all here. Feel free to wander through the studios and enjoy campus while you're here. Again, Scott, thank you.
Thank you. Are they having that?
No, it's perfect. You hit your whole speech.